Well, Tim did an excellent job in setting up the issue here because as we well understand that we're living in a world that's immersed in data, and that the ways that we've traditionally thought about it in terms of privacy, the harms of releasing data versus the harms of not sharing it have changed. So we're moving into a new era. And what we have are two panelists who represent sort of the tension that's in this new world. And on my right is Loretta, well, right here, Loretta Garrison from the FTC. She's a senior attorney there, representing a regulatory perspective, and then Ellen Blackler, who's the executive director for policy at AT&T. And here with a mobile carrier, you have a company who is really in the midst of this, creating new kind of, capturing a lot of data on people, but the question is, how can they monetize it? How can they create a framework for the appropriate sharing of it? So what I'd like to do is just sit down and have a conversation about raising this issue, about how you are going to protect private information and at the same time share it. And when you recognize that you have what's happening already in the world is you have a lot of behavioral data, location-based data is being captured and used. And how do we create a framework? How do we create a new way of thinking about this that allows this data, as Tim was saying, the utility of this data to be realized, but at the same time be respectful of people's need for privacy? And what kind of new kind of business models, new kind of business environment do you see? Ellen, I'll start with you on this and your perspective on this. And where do you see this going?
Well, I think we really need to have a paradigm shift. What we used to do in privacy was think a lot about how to help people keep their information close, keep it from being exposed. And what we've learned is that in the new world, we need to think about how to help people share, but on their own terms. So it's no more about kind of security, locking it up and giving out little pieces. It's giving people the tools they need to share their data, but then giving them the way to control that. And I think that is what makes this so difficult to regulate around, is that we don't quite know what that means yet.
Right.
And we need innovation around the tools. We actually have to figure that out. And at the same time, there's concerns about some of the worst practices. So it's a really difficult, we don't envy Loretta's job. It's a really difficult task to figure out how to, stop the bad guys and the bad practices, but allow for the innovation. So I think it's one of the real friction points as we move from this kind of 1.0 to a 2.0 environment.
Well, Loretta, I mean, a lot of the sort of the key principles, the regulatory principles that go all the way back to the '76 Privacy Act, and you have the concept of personal identifying information, you have fair information principles and practices. These have been a cornerstone of thinking about it, but it's very difficult to, in a sense, carry those forward, I would contend. And because the technology is changing so quickly, the business models are changing, the environment is changing, you may have a reflex, as I have a equivalent of do not call, do not opt in, opt out kind of models. But where do you see a new kind of framework, a new way of thinking about this, and what kind of sort of collaboration can be between industry and different public sector groups about how to think about this?
Well, thank you, John. And I need to first give the usual disclaimer that I'm only here speaking personally and not on behalf of the Commission or any of the individual commissioners. I do agree with Ellen. This is a very challenging new world. Both you and Ellen did participate, John, in our series of roundtables on exploring privacy because the FTC decided about a year ago that we do need to step back and look much more broadly at what's going on, the impact of technology, both online and offline, and what this means for the protection of consumer information, both from a security perspective as well as from a privacy perspective. I think that we heard several things come out of that. First of all, there's no such thing really as anonymity on the web. I think that it's very clear that there are so many little digital trails of information that are able to be assembled both online and offline that can create very detailed profiles. And so that calls into question the basic framework that we have of whether you've got personally identifiable information or non-personally identifiable information. And at least in my opinion, and again from what we heard from the panelists, this distinction as a matter of legal analysis really doesn't make sense anymore. So we need to look at information broadly. Of course, then people talk about sort of information in general and highly sensitive information, but there's no agreement on what comprises sensitive information and where you draw the lines and what kinds of rules that there ought to be. There also are no rules of the road in this environment because the technology is moving so rapidly. It's really outpaced the policy making. We clearly can see the enormous benefits, the GIS demonstration just a few minutes ago, both from a policymaker perspective as well as broader societal good. On the other hand, many of you know about the negative aspects of this, and so it is a very clear challenge going forward.
Well, there are a lot of the old mechanisms that notice and consent were being used, and as a way, or people can opt in and opt out. Does that seem to be, are we going to have to rethink that in terms of how you're going to engage the consumer in this, and what is their intent? I mean, is it going to be not just a combination of sort of new regulations or laws or statutes, but there may be new kinds of technologies that you can visualize, such that rather than counting on and notice, people can see things? I mean, you see that coming in, that there's going to be a mixture of technology
absolutely.
and law rules is going to be very important to this.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, there's already innovation around notice. The advertising, Network Advertising Initiative has launched a consumer research project to develop some enhanced notice using the tools online to be able to tell people about targeted or behavioral advertising. So this is an early step in this process. The agencies themselves have done some consumer research around the financial privacy notices, and in fact, we just announced the rule last December. So we now see financial institutions that are using the new model form, which was developed through consumer testing. But our reliance on notice in the past, I think it's been demonstrated that you can't expect consumers to read all of these notices, to understand what's going on, and to be able to make decisions. And again, we're talking about having some rules of the road so that we get a better balancing between what the technology can do and what the consumers expect. So we really need to factor in the expectations of the consumer in this. And we do have a disconnect between the social mores in the offline world. For example, when I mail a letter to John, I don't expect it to be opened and read and recorded. And yet, in the offline world, there are those values don't carry over. Right.
Well, given that it's difficult for the consumer to understand all the choices that they have to make and understand what they're interested, there are going to be some trusted parties going to have to act on their behalf, and so the whole discussion of identity providers coming in. And the mobile carriers in a role or a position actually perhaps to be identity providers in this new space. Ellen, and you agree with that? And in some sense, are they going to be a trusted party? Are they going to be accountable to the consumer in some way, where you may have a system in the cloud where you're able to put your data and they can act on your behalf? Do you see that kind of thing coming into the marketplace, new business models, and thinking about a role to be played by the carriers in that?
Yeah, I think we really think a lot about how to make this more usable for the customers, because it's clear that reading a bunch of privacy notices is not the future. So we talk about a couple things. One is functionalizing these privacy controls so that you can see what's happening to you when it's happening. We've seen some of that with this notice that hopefully will soon appear on advertisements, so you'll know that this particular ad is related to some kind of behavioral advertising. We've seen some innovation. Apple now has this little arrow up on its menu bar, so if your location is being shared, you can see right then your location is being shared. You don't have to go back and sort through all these privacy statements. And I think what we need to do more of is be more usable and really focus on this interoperability of permissions idea, so that customers don't have to tell Facebook, AT&T, Google, and Amazon how they want to be treated. That once they establish their permissions, one of the privacy advocates once said, "Why aren't I telling you my privacy policy and you people adhering to mine?" And I think that's a good question. And we have to think about how we can it's a little kind of trite, but I think we have to think about how can we get there? How can we make this more usable for the customers? And who then would the customers be trusting to do that? It doesn't have to be any one person. There could be multiple kind of entities managing that for the customers who could put their preferences out there, and then the rest of the internet will adapt.
Well, then that means that people, this is the user-centric notion, that people have control over their own information about themselves, and that it'll be interoperable across different kind of networks, that basically it's mobile with you. And there'll be some party, that will, in a sense, represent your interests, and you have choices between those. And this is something that's coming out of the White House on NSTIC, and that was National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. These trust frameworks, a new kind of identity ecosystem, that you may have a proliferation of different kind of trust frameworks that compete in terms of how they meet consumer demand. Does that strike you, Loretta, as a valid or avenue to look the ways of thinking this going forward?
I think that's definitely a very important development, and especially for transactions that the consumer will do online that are around highly sensitive information, financial information,
right,
health information, and so forth. The consumer really needs to know who they're dealing with, and likewise, the entity needs to know that the consumer is who he or she represents, that they are. So I think that the work that's being done in this area is very important and very critical. I think, though, however, it addresses just one segment of what people do online, because, of course, they do all kinds of searches, they do
right,
location information, the social networking. So there are many activities, probably some we haven't even heard of yet, that people engage in, that this kind of a trusted framework won't necessarily apply or be useful.
I see. Well, what about the whole idea of behavioral tracking and behavioral data? And then that is increasingly taking off, and you have exchanges now that exist for that. And what kind of regulatory role or framework do you think would be appropriate to, and their new business model is going to come out of this? I mean, if personal data becomes a kind of asset that people have, and they can be traded and on different exchanges, and people can get benefit from it. Do you see this as something that needs to be open, and how might it be regulated? I mean, are we moving into the new world of finance, so the financial models around personal information?
So okay. I think that there needs to be, one of the things we need to do going forward is try to marry up all this work that's been going on the identity management field that's really focused right, on kind of identity theft and single sign-on, and
right,
and marry it up with the other parts of your identity that are out there on the internet. Your web tracking data, your data gleaned from social networks, that's part of your identity in the new world. And right, if it's a data-driven economy, we do need to think about where is the infrastructure to support that, and who's got the data, and who's getting benefit of the data, and how you control it. So one of the things we'd like to see is that notion of identity that we talk about in the identity management space expanded to think about these more, what in some ways is a passive part of your identity that you're not even aware you're creating when you're out there. And, there ought to be a way to control that too. So if you've got a profile out there that says you like cars and sports,
right,
why isn't that profile in your control? And you get to decide who knows you like cars and sports.
So what you're saying then is that people would have something like their own personal data store where they'd have access to that, and that would be a resource that is legitimately, they're in control in some form.
Right, and then can fuel. I think the question is, can we give the advertisers say they
right,
want to advertise to people who want their stuff, so there ought to be a marrying of interest in there. So is there a way to create that data and give the advertisers access to it, but the customers control for it? I think that's the challenge we have to keep kind of the basic, in some ways advertising-driven right, internet afloat.
But there are a couple of other factors there. One is that right now the consumers don't really understand what's going on. And so I think that is a real issue that needs to be addressed. I mean, they sort of know they're being tracked, but they don't really understand the wealth of information that's being collected and the many different parties who are involved and the various ways in which it can be used, both to benefit them, but may also be misused in ways that can harm them. And we're talking about all information, including medical information. If anybody read the Wall Street Journal series online, you've read that, for example, when you go on the Merriam-Webster dictionary and you're searching for certain health information, that is being tracked and assembled. And in some cases, that information is identifiable enough that people actually start receiving information in the mail. So part of this is an imbalance in terms of information. And second, what does control really mean? Individuals really don't have that leveraging power with companies. And also, there ought to be an element where if they don't want to be tracked, they ought to be able to say no. So I think that there are many complicated issues here that we all need to address. And I think that the technologists, the companies, and the policymakers all need to work together to address it.
That's great. Well, our time is up. And we just certainly weren't able to solve this, but I think we certainly raised some of the key issues. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.